Tension in the South Africa-U.S. relationship. What's causing it and what does it mean for future ties between the two countries? Hello, I'm Naidu and this is The Heat. The relationship between South Africa and the United States is going through a rough period. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is a major factor in driving tensions between the sides. Pretoria has taken a neutral position on the crisis, but has close ties with Moscow. That's caused pushback from Washington. Meanwhile, both countries continue to have a strong economic relationship. To examine the impact of all of this, we begin with former South African ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool. He joins us from Cape Town. Ambassador, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be on.
Looking at this relationship between the United States and South Africa, it's a very complex relationship. During the Cold War, South Africa, the white minority government in South Africa, was seen as something of a bulwark against the spread of communism in southern Africa. There was, if not overt, but tacit support for the National Party in South Africa at that time. Yet, the United States also took the lead in imposing sanctions against that white minority government to bring an end to apartheid. And once apartheid had ended, Nelson Mandela was on the scene, and he had a very cordial relationship with American leaders, notably with Bill Clinton. But now we see rising tensions. How did we get to this point?
Look, I think that the ostensible reason, the immediate one at this point, is South Africa's position with regards to the Ukraine war, that South Africa, together with 17 other African states, refused to vote to condemn the Russian invasion of Ukraine, much to the chagrin of the United States. And secondly, under this guise of neutrality, they also reminded the USA that there was no reason for NATO to be extending itself in a post-Cold War world. And so, in a sense, I think that's the immediate reason for this. But I do also believe that it is that South Africa is hosting the BRICS summit later this month, and that within that BRICS summit, there is the systematic building of a more multipolar world away from a unipolar world that has, for the last few decades since the fall of the Berlin Wall, been led by the United States. And within that multipolarity that is being developed, there's the idea of moving away from the dollar as the standard of exchange. There is the idea of multiplying the instruments of trade in the world. There is the push for a more representative and inclusive United Nations, especially its Security Council. And I think that that's unsettling for a United States that since 1989 has gotten used to unilateralism, unipolarity, and getting its own way in this world. And so I think those are some of the deeper reasons. And the feeling is that in this BRICS summit, there may be some far-reaching decisions that will affect the multipolarity of the world.
So, Ambassador, would it be a mistake for us to assume that what is going on between South Africa and the United States right now is something that's happening in isolation? I mean, if we look at this in the broader context that you were just talking about, then this seems to be a much broader offensive, diplomatic offensive by the United States to win back friends, to have more influence in those parts of the world where it feels it's losing influence.
No, I think certainly the United States now for the first time feels that it has to compete for the allegiance. It was very much, and with great gratitude, it was very much feeling fairly confident that it was sending PEPFAR aid to fight HIV/AIDS across Africa, and particularly South Africa, that it had a one-way trade agreement through the African Growth and Opportunities Act. That makes enormous difference. And so even a country like South Africa and other African countries, while it ushers in a multipolar world, has to be very cognizant of the fact that the United States has certain preferential agreements with Africa, and so South Africa and Africa's interests must be managed, but not always at the expense of the values that Africa and South Africa holds dear, such as a world where there is no unilateralism, where one country can't decide to invade another country, like in Iraq or Afghanistan, where one country can give the green light for an invasion to one country to enter Yemen, or where one country can turn a blind eye to what's happening in Palestine. I think that's increasingly becoming challenging in terms of the values that developing countries are holding. And I think that there is this new term that is emerging, and South Africa is probably part of it. It's called hedging, not putting all your eggs in one basket, keeping your options open, bargaining for a better deal in a multipolar world. And this really would be part of the deeper issues that I think are at stake in what appears to be a standoff between South Africa and the United States.
Right, as you pointed, one of the immediate reasons for the deterioration in relations between Washington and Pretoria is the Russia-Ukraine conflict and South Africa's view on that. There was also another development very recently in South Africa, and it appears relations really nosedived after that. And that was when the U.S. ambassador to South Africa accused the country of supplying weapons to Russia. He provided no proof of this, and South Africa itself has agreed to conduct some kind of inquiry, a commission of inquiry into what happened here. What is the status of that, and how did that contribute to this deterioration in relations?
No, I think it was both a deterioration in relations. It was a low point for an American ambassador to almost lead full frontal on an offensive like that. But I also think his objective may have been achieved because he fired a warning shot at South Africa, reminding South Africa of its interests that are very largely based in the United States with, as I said, PEPFAR, AGOA, 600 U.S. companies, massive investment and employment opportunities in South Africa. So he was reminding South Africa of that. I think it was backed up by a bipartisan congressional pronouncement that said South Africa should be ejected from some of those preferential agreements. And the result is that South Africa has, in a sense, had to get rid of some of the clumsy elements of its diplomacy and begin to find a perfect balance between its values and its interests, and hence a delegation going to Washington to plead the case for AGOA, as well as shuttle diplomacy with President Putin to persuade him not to come to South Africa for the BRICS summit. And so I think it's working out well, and we're finding a balance again in the world without sacrificing any interests or values in the process.
There is talk in the United States right now for a major review of the relationship with South Africa. In fact, some have called for a major overhaul of that relationship. There is a bill in the United States Congress right now which criticizes South Africa for taking part in joint military exercises with Russia as well as with China, with remaining neutral in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as you pointed out, for trading with China. And there was a bipartisan group of congressmen that sent a letter to senior officials in the Biden administration calling on the United States to scrap a major trade summit that was due to be held in South Africa. But at the same time, when we look at the hard numbers, South Africa's trade relationship with the United States is worth $21 billion, which is a lot of money. What are the risks if Pretoria allows this situation to deteriorate?
I think the risks are clear, but I also think that the United States is as aware of the risks to itself in alienating what has emerged in the G20 as the proxy for Africa within the global architecture. And so, in a sense, I think both South Africa and the United States are finding moments of recoil. They are pulling back from the kind of zero-sum game that may have been occasioned by the U.S. ambassador's offensive. I think there are repairs that are beginning to take place, but I also think that the United States understands that the world will not be as unipolar as it was just a few years ago, that Africa, South Africa, the developing world, they have options, they're building those options, they're looking for alternatives to, for example, the dollar regime. They're looking for alternative funding models, not just the World Bank and the IMF. They're looking for ways out of being bullied into carrying all the costs for climate change, for example, and demanding that there be co-responsibility, with most of the responsibility being with those, for example, who have been the biggest emitters of carbons into the atmosphere. So I think we're going to find an aversion of the great confrontation, and I think we're probably both sides going to come out of it chastened and changed as we move forward.
Now, there is a senior Biden administration official, Victoria Nuland, who is visiting South Africa. There will be a separate visit by a Democratic Party congressman, Gregory Meeks, who's a very senior member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. In fact, he's the ranking member. How do you interpret these visits?
I think it's part of what I'm calling the rebalancing of the relationship, the chastening moment, and finding a way to coexist within a multilateral world. You see, part of the reason that so many in the developing world, in Africa, and particularly South Africa, have been reticent about simply joining the bandwagon of condemnation on Ukraine is simply because a Russian defeat in Ukraine would create a power vacuum that the world will not recover from, will create a unilateralism and a triumphalism that I think will be bad for the world. And so, in a sense, I think that all of these shuttle diplomacies that are taking place, I think, are ways of self-correction and rebalancing, as I've said.
So rebalancing for the United States, but it's also quite a balancing act for South Africa, isn't it? Because, I mean, it's had a very good relationship with Moscow, initially with the Soviet Union, which played a very big role in overthrowing apartheid. We just saw President Ramaphosa in Moscow meeting with the, in St. Petersburg rather, meeting with the Russian President Putin. But at the same time, South Africa would want to placate U.S. concerns. So how much of a balancing act is that for South Africa? Can it do it?
I think so, and I think it would be really good if, for example, South Africa were to give a dignified way out for President Putin to extricate himself from the Ukraine conflict. I don't think someone like President Putin would want to be bullied by the United States, by Europe, into a ceasefire, into ending the war. But if friendly forces were to succeed in persuading him that that war is not just unsustainable, he can win it eventually, but it's unsustainable, it's having dire global impacts, and therefore use our facilitation as Africans to withdraw from the war, that would make the world an eminently better place. And so maybe I think that would be factored in by the US in the balancing of that war. Otherwise, they will find, like Afghanistan, that Ukraine will be a bottomless pit into which they're pumping resources, into which they're sustaining conflict. It's not that one side will win or be defeated, but it will just be a 30-year war with enormous costs and no outcome.
Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you very much.
And for more now, joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Renee Sanders. She is a former U.S. ambassador to Nigeria and the Republic of Congo, who served during the Bush and Obama administrations. Joining us too from Cape Town is Sanusha Naidu. She is a senior research fellow with the Institute for Global Dialogue. And also joining the discussion is Abdullahi Boru Halaki. He is an Africa security and policy analyst. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ambassador Sanders, great to have you with us. As I said, there are now tensions in the relationship between South Africa and the United States. In fact, a senior Biden official, Victoria Nuland, is in South Africa right now to talk about the relationship, and a Democrat Congressman, Gregory Meeks, is due to go to South Africa for the same reason. The immediate reason we understand for these tensions is South Africa's neutral stance in the conflict in Ukraine. So that raises the question, what kind of relationship would the United States like to have with South Africa?
I think that the first part of your question in terms of Russia-Ukraine being a driving force in the tension is spot on, is exactly right. But where I differ, however, is the position that South Africa has shared with us, that it's non-aligned. You cannot be non-aligned if you are helping with weapons transfers in a conflict, and particularly to one belligerent in a conflict. And so I think where we're uncomfortable and what we don't understand is you're telling us that you're not aligned, but in the secondary phase, you're still helping with one of the belligerents, in this case, Russia, particularly with weapons and weapons transfers. You'll note that the South African government didn't deny that when we said it publicly. They weren't happy that we said it publicly, but in the end, our challenge is really you're not aligned, but in the end, you're doing something like this, and those two things do not match up.
Right. There is a bill which is currently in Congress. It's going through the process right now, which is very critical of the South Africans. There's also that letter that was a bipartisan group signed, which called for the United States to scrap a major trade summit that was due to be held in South Africa. At least one South African security expert, her name is Jasmine Opperman at the University of Pretoria, she referenced the bill that's in Congress, and she says the United States, in her belief, is trying to strong-arm South Africa. She calls the bill in Congress an act of desperation and an act of coercion. What is your response to that?
I think it's a bit of hyperbole in the description, but there's several sects in the U.S. government, like there are everywhere else. There's the congressional representation, and they have their views on something, and there is the administration. I think from the administration's point of view, you can see with the two visits that are happening now and that will happen, that the U.S. government itself, in terms of the executive branch, wants to restore relations. We then have to, together, South Africa and the administration, really talk with our members of Congress to say that, cutting off trade with South Africa doesn't serve us well, and certainly doesn't serve the South African government well or the South African people well. But I don't think you can base it down to hyperbole that we're trying to strong-arm South Africa. I think that the problem, as I said in my first comment, you can't on one hand tell us that you're not aligned to our face, and then on the other hand, assist with weapons transfers.
Sanusha Naidu, I want to get to the point that Ambassador Sanders raised about the transfer of weapons from South Africa to Russia. The ambassador points out that you can't be non-aligned if you supply weapons to a country that is at war. This is, of course, a reference to a statement made by the United States ambassador to South Africa, in which he said that South Africa had provided weapons to Russia. Neither the ambassador nor anyone else, as far as I know, have provided any proof that weapons were indeed transferred. And South Africa is currently conducting an inquiry into this. But what do you make of her statement that you can't be non-aligned if you supply weapons?
Good day, Anand, and good day to the panel. I apologize, I couldn't hear the ambassador very clearly, so I'm just going to go on what you have paraphrased for me in terms of the ambassador's reply. I think the challenge is really the question of the issue of what was going on in terms of the ship or the vessel that docked at the naval port, what was being offloaded and what was being put onto the ship. And at this point in time, we still are unsure of what the contents are in terms of that goods, equipment, and anything else that was put onto the ship. We have a commission of inquiry. We're waiting for that commission of inquiry to go through the process and come up with its findings. We also know that from the side of the U.S. that there hasn't been any communication or any kind of proof in terms of where the statement comes from. And I think from the U.S. side, my interpretation is that they're waiting for the findings to come through. And once the findings come through, then I think that will go forward. So at this point in time, I think just like everyone else, we're not sure. We do know that there was a vessel there, but we're not sure what was put on and what was not, what was taken off. I think if it is arms, I think there will definitely be, in terms of what's currently happening in our domestic environment, there is a question around what the vessel was doing at the naval port, and in terms of the naval port being a security port as well, in terms of our national security. But I think it's also kind of, if I can be as bold to say, a bit premature at this point, because we are waiting for that communication from both sides, both from the South African side and from the US side. And we know it's a delicate situation, and we know that there are a lot of diplomatic cables that go back and forth, and intelligence cables that are going back and forth, which cannot be put into the public domain at this point in time.
Sanusha, looking at the border relationship between the United States and South Africa, and the deep concerns that have been expressed by the United States for South Africa's neutral stance on the conflict in Ukraine, South Africa, of course, is an independent sovereign state and is fully entitled to conduct its foreign policy in its own interest, not in the interests of another country.
Well, we'd like to think we do so, but unfortunately, I think this war in Ukraine has put the world on notice, especially countries in Africa, especially South Africa, which I think has taken a lot of body blows on this, because its communication has not been clear about what non-alignment means. And so South African government has been defending its position, and sometimes I think the defense of its position seems to come across as it's defending Russia and defending Russia's position, or not taking a position on Russia and not taking a position in support of Ukraine. And I think this is what the complexity and the contestation is right now of the world. There are some countries who can actually say they're non-aligned or they have strategic autonomy. One country that comes to mind recently has been India, and it has articulated that in a very coherent, very clear manner, and the US has kind of treaded very carefully around India. I think when it comes to South Africa, I think there's a lot of expectation of South African foreign policy to be what others want it to be. And I think this is where the complexity and both sides, the South African government and of course the international community, who are placing these issues on our doorstep in terms of pushing us towards this kind of thing, to say that we need to do this. It's difficult to extricate yourself from this, because at the end of the day, it's not just about whether we assert our autonomy and our sovereignty, but it's also about the kind of collateral damage that impacts us, whether it's secondary sanctions because we didn't do what others told us to do.
Right. Abdullahi, of course, this is a two-way street, as Ambassador Rasool pointed out to us at the beginning of the show. South Africa is also important to the relationship with the United States. Question is, how important is South Africa to this relationship, and how indicative is that importance in terms of the US relationship with the entire continent?
Now, that's precisely. I think I want to, before I answer your question, I want to make two points. One is the fact that we are certainly not in a multipolar world, but certainly we are not also in a unipolar world that is largely underwritten by the United States. So what that means is the United States cannot have it both ways. Secondly, African countries, and South Africa included, cannot have it both ways either. They cannot at the same time, say we're pursuing a Pan-Africanist foreign policy and then use it only instrumentally. What do I mean here? Western countries, particularly the United States, every time they invoke human rights, you clearly do know that it is something that has had their interest. African countries, every time they invoke Pan-Africanism, you should damn be sure that there have been a spotlight on them. So as such, I think the hypocrisy cuts both ways. African countries, if they want to pursue a very clear, non-aligned foreign policy, they should pursue it as such. Western countries, if they say that democracy and human rights underpins all their engagements with African countries, they should pursue as well. The question is, both has got its own costs. To the point where, what is the role and what is the relationship, what is the value of South African relationship with the United States? It is critical, in the sense that South Africa, for all its fault, still remains a fairly preeminent power on the continent. It's not as powerful as it used to be. Some of the glow that South Africa, especially after the end of of apartheid, has been slowly eroded, but it still remains a very powerful, if not at a very material level, though it is, at a very symbolic level. If anybody loses South Africa, then that includes the United States, there is a sense that potentially a window has been cracked on how, potentially they could lose the continent. But the reality is, I think Western countries really need to realize that they cannot dictate. What Mandela said when he came out of prison was, you cannot choose for us our friends and enemies. Western countries' enemies are not necessarily African countries' enemies. So we have to be very careful the way this is done.
Ambassador Sanders, what is your view on the point that Abdullahi made, that we no longer live totally in a unipolar world? We now live in a multipolar world where the global south is becoming very vocal in having its voice heard. It doesn't want to be forced to choose sides.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I mean, even on this show many times before and other media over the last 10 years, I have said that the U.S. cannot be colonialist in Africa. And I do think with this administration that they have made that pivot very clearly, and they certainly did it, certainly in the Biden Leaders Summit that was held in December. So yes, we get that. But the difference here, and I do agree with the earlier panelists that we need to see what the final investigation says. But what is unclear is what South Africa means by being non-aligned. And as long as that is murky, then the reactions here in the U.S. will be up and down as well. We are making the effort, as you indicated at the top of the show, with administration officials in South Africa, having these discussions. So the dialogue is still there and the dialogue is still open. So yes, we are definitely in a multipolar world. We cannot be neo-colonial in our behavior and our speech.
Yeah.
And I think that this administration has turned the corner on that in what it says and what it does. And the effort to have a dialogue and address these contentious issues are evident there by the fact that we have senior administration officials going there to do so.
Sanusha, we only have a little time left, less than a minute, but I want to address this. As I said earlier, South Africa's trade with the United States is worth $21 billion, far more than its trade with Russia. Also, I should add at this point that its biggest trading partner, of course, is China. But the fact that South Africa's trade is worth $21 billion with the United States, I mean, that's a stark fact. And doesn't that really narrow South Africa's ability to maneuver in this diplomatic to and fro that we're seeing right now?
Well, it's definitely part of the debate that's currently happening around South Africa's eligibility to remain on the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. And that seems to be a key issue in terms of the number of different stakeholders, not necessarily only in government, but outside of government, including business and, of course, provincial governments like the Democratic Alliance in the Western Cape, who have, in terms of the Western Cape, if you look at the number of exports that go through AGOA in terms of access to the US market, plays a critical role in terms of this trade. So I think it's definitely a factor, and definitely one that, if you look at consultations that are happening with our Minister of Trade and Industry also in the US and having these discussions, they really are seeing the criticalness and the significance of that trade. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it is an overwhelming one that gives you less room for maneuver. I think both sides have the maneuverability to see how this trade can be deepened in terms of going forward.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.